There's a fair chance you've already heard the animal in this story tonight. Its voice is on the sleep apps and the rain playlists, in spa lobbies and in 10-hour videos with moonlit thumbnails. That long, climbing call with the ocean behind it, the sound the whole world has agreed to file under calm. Most of us met the animal itself in childhood, as a fact, the biggest creature that has ever lived, bigger than any dinosaur, a heart the size of whatever the poster said. Later, it surfaced again in the documentaries, filmed from above in clear blue water, moving the way weather moves. A voice and an image, enormous, gentle, far away, and somehow on our side. That is the whale most of us are carrying. It's a newer whale than it feels. 3 or 4 generations ago, people carried an entirely different animal in their heads, and the quickest way into theirs is through a small, plain object that used to sit on ordinary tables. In the cases of a few museums, there's a kind of candle called a sperm candle, off-white, hard, smooth as soap, cast 6 to the pound of wax. It doesn't look like much beside the harpoons, but in 1860, when Parliament in London had to write down what light itself would legally mean, the definition it settled on was the flame of one sperm candle, 6 to the pound, burning 120 grains of wax an hour. The gas companies were selling Brightest to whole cities by then, and Brightest could not be sold until it could be measured. So the measure became that candle, and the candle was pressed from an oil found in the head of a whale. Candle power. For the better part of a century, whenever an engineer rated a lighthouse, a street lamp, or eventually the headlamp of a car, the candle inside the unit was a whale. And the candle was only the finest grade of the trade. By the 1740s, something like 5,000 street lamps in London burned whale oil through the night. Boston lit its streets the same way from 1773. The lighthouses of the American coast ran on it for decades, all night, every night. The clocks and watches of the 19th century were oiled with it because it neither gummed nor froze. So were the sewing machines and the mill spindles and the rifles. Even when the lamps finally gave way to kerosene and then to the bulb, the whale stayed on in the machinery. Into the early 1970s, the automatic gearbox in a new American car still shifted on sperm whale oil. Put those pieces together and the shape comes through. For roughly 2 centuries, the light of the modern world, the light ordinary evenings happened by, the light every novel was read by and every late letter written by, was rendered out of the bodies of the largest animals that have ever existed. None of that is a figure of speech. It is what the ledgers say, in gallons and in pounds sterling. Months in those records leave a strange residue. The detail that keeps snagging isn't the scale, it's the ordinariness. Nobody in 1850 thought of it as burning whales. It was just the lamp, the way a switch is just a switch. Almost none of this gets told. The whale we carry now, the voice, the gentleness, the impossible size, has replaced the whale they carried so completely that the two hardly seem like the same animal. And underneath the whole question sits one quiet fact. Some whales live so long that, in all likelihood, a few of the animals out in the dark of the Arctic tonight were already swimming when the world was still lit that way. If long, slow, true stories are what brought you here, subscribing is the simplest way to keep them coming. And before you drift off, leave one answer in the comments. Have you ever met a whale yourself? The animal, not a recording. And where were you when it happened? Answers like that, gathered under a video like this one, would have been unthinkable to nearly everyone in this story, and reading them is one of the quiet pleasures of making it. As for the animal, it was old before any of it. The body this story turns on was finished in every detail that would one day matter to a lamplighter, long before there was anyone to light a lamp for. It has been carrying the beginning of all of it since before our kind existed, and it is far older than the oldest thing we ever made from it. The animal at the head of this story enters it on 4 legs. It's about the size of a wolf standing at the edge of a slow brown river, and the light comes off the water so hard that everything at the margin, mud, reeds, the animal itself, looks hammered out of the same hot metal. Insects drone in the reeds, fish hang in the shallows. The animal wades in after them with an ease its build does nothing to explain, puts its head under and waits. It has a long muzzle, a heavy tail, toes that end in little hooves, and deep in its skull, wrapped around the machinery of its hearing, there is a thickened dome of bone that exists in no other family of animals on Earth except one. That dome belongs to whales. Every whale ever examined carries it, and nothing else does. This particular skull came out of dry hills in northern Pakistan, from rock that was laid down as coastline around 50 million years ago, and the ankle bones found in the same hills settled the other half of the question. They are the ankles of the cloven-hoofed family, the group that today holds deer and cattle and pigs and hippos. Ask a genetics lab instead of a quarry, and the same answer comes back. The whale's closest living relatives are the hippopotamuses. The largest animal in the history of life is a cousin of the herd. What followed took roughly 10 million years, which is a very long time, and also, for what was accomplished in it, almost hurried. No plan was being followed. Each generation simply contained a few animals that could feed a little farther out than their parents, and on that coast, in that age, farther out kept paying. A few million years past the river wader, there is a cousin built along crocodile lines, low and long-jawed, an ambush swimmer that could still haul itself up a bank. Later, shapes let the bank go. The nostrils crept over thousands of generations, from the tip of the muzzle to the crown of the skull, until breathing became something done briefly at the surface, on the move. The legs shortened, the tail broadened into the engine. But the lungs stayed lungs. Whatever else the water remade, it never took the air out of this animal. So the whale carries to this day a debt to the surface, collected every few minutes for as long as it lives. By about 38 million years ago, the commitment was total. In Egypt's western desert, there is a valley called Wadi al-Hitan, the Valley of the Whales, where the floor of that vanished sea lies open under the sun, and the proof is scattered across it in the plainest form imaginable, whole skeletons, some 18 meters from skull to tail, resting in the sand where they settled. The creature they belonged to was so unfamiliar when science first met it in the 1830s that it was taken for a huge marine reptile and named Basilosaurus, king lizard, a name that has now been wrong for nearly 2 centuries without anyone managing to dislodge it. Walk far enough along one of those skeletons and, near the tail, the sand gives up a pair of hind legs. The length of a forearm, complete with knees and toes, on an animal longer than a house, too small to carry anything, not yet gone. The valley around them is silent, the light has weight, and the stone vertebrae hold the day's heat the way loaves hold an oven's. The pyramids stand a morning's drive from that valley, and the distance between us and the people who raised them is about 4,500 years. It takes 11,000 distances like that, laid end to end, to reach back to these animals. The whales that survived that age divided across the long afterward around 2 different answers to the question of food. One branch gave up teeth entirely and grew in their place curtains of a horn-like material, the same protein as a fingernail hanging from the upper jaw in hundreds of tapered plates, and turned, eating into filtering. Take in a great swallow of ocean, press it back out through the curtain, keep what stays. The stuff is light, springy, and nearly impossible to break, and it will matter again in rooms a long way from any sea. The other branch kept its teeth and built an instrument in its forehead instead, a case of fine oil and tuned tissue that lets the animal throw sound ahead of itself into the dark and read what returns, hunting in the lightless deep by hearing. The clicks that come out of that organ are the loudest sounds made by any living animal, and that, for the record, is the oil of the candle in the statute book. The wax parliament used to define light was pressed from an organ built for listening. Somewhere in all this branching, one line also picked up a stranger habit. Long patterned sequences of calling, minutes at a stretch, repeated and repeated, which nothing on earth was yet in a position to overhear. For most of their 50 million years, whales were not giants. Large, certainly, the size of buses and boats, but the true immensity arrived only within the last 4.5 million years, and possibly far more recently than that. What changed was the ocean itself. The world was cooling toward its ice ages. The winds sharpened, and along certain coasts, cold, deep water began rising in seasonal surges that turned whole regions of sea into brief, absurd banquets. Krill gathering in drifts dense enough to stain acres of surface red. In water that behaves like that, the animals that could take the biggest single mouthful and carry the biggest reserve between feasts as a deep wrap of fat beneath the skin left the most descendants. The filter feeders' bodies ran away upward in size to a degree nothing on land has ever approached. On the clock this chapter keeps, that is yesterday. The ocean had whales for some 45 million years before it had giants. The giant itself resists ordinary measurement. A blue whale can reach about 30 meters, and the heaviest one ever actually weighed was weighed in pieces on a factory deck in 1947. The books record somewhere between 170 and 190 tons, depending on how the blood that drained away is counted, because no scale has ever existed that could take one whole. Her heart would have weighed about as much as an upright piano, which turns out to be the real answer to the poster. On a deep dive, that heart can slow to 2 beats a minute. We know because a researcher once managed to press a recorder onto a living blue whale with suction cups and ride out 8 hours of its day. And when one of these animals feeds, a single lunge takes in more water than the whale itself weighs. The scientists who measure such things have called it the largest biomechanical event on the planet. On this one point, the childhood poster was simply right. Nothing bigger has ever lived. So there the animal stands, complete, with everything human still to come. Fuel under the skin, a filter of horn or an instrument of wax in the head, a voice that can cross an ocean basin, lungs that owe the surface a visit every few minutes. A sea of giants carrying the whole inventory with no one anywhere to want any of it. When one of them died offshore, the body might drift for weeks before it went down whole into the dark, where it fed a patient neighborhood of the deep for years. And when the sea pushed one ashore instead, it lay on the sand in all its tonnage, unclaimed, birds working at it, weather taking it down, because nothing had yet come to the beach with hands. The hands turn up in the north of Spain about 20,000 years ago. Somebody there, seated in a cave mouth within sound of the Atlantic, finished a spear point, a narrow, patient piece of work as long as a hand, ground smooth, its base beveled to seat against a shaft. Hunters of that age made such points by the thousand, usually from antler. This one is different, and its difference is the reason it matters now. It was carved from the bone of a whale. It isn't alone either. Museum stores from the French Basque country down along the Spanish coast hold dozens of them, and when researchers recently read the old collagen in the bone, protein keeps a signature, species by species, long after the animal is gone. The list that came back was sperm whale, fin whale, blue whale, grey whale, and either right whales or their Arctic cousins, which the protein cannot tell apart. Ice Age Europe, in other words, knew the giants well enough to work them like timber. And one name on that list lands strangely on a modern ear, because the grey whale has been gone from the entire Atlantic Ocean for some 300 years. 20,000 years ago, its bones lay on Spanish beaches in enough plenty to be worth carving. None of this means anyone was hunting them. The points were shaped from windfalls, bodies the sea delivered, and that is exactly what makes them feel close. People with no metal and no writing stood over the same animal we've been describing, tonnage and heart and all, and their first thought was the thought a person has. What can be made of this? Even that is not the beginning. In a cave on the southern tip of Africa, in layers laid down well over 100,000 years ago, excavators found a barnacle. A particular barnacle, a shell the size of a walnut, belonging to a species that grows on right whales and on nothing else in the sea. It did not crawl up a cliff into a cave by itself. Someone carried a slab of stranded whale, skin and shell and all, home to the fire. That is the entire case resting on one small shell, which is a great deal of weight for a shell to carry, and also how this kind of history usually works. The deep past survives as crumbs, and honesty means saying which crumb the claim stands on. Taken together, the crumbs say people were eating whales for 100,000 years before anyone, anywhere, farmed so much as a bean. Whether anyone in deep prehistory went further, went out after them, hangs on a cliff face in South Korea. Above a river near the city of Ulsan, carvers pecked hundreds of figures into the rock, and among them are some 60 whales. Whales with calves, whales head down, mid-dive, and shapes that many researchers read as boats, lines and floats fast to living animals. Read that way, it is the oldest picture of whale hunting on Earth, and it has been formally celebrated as exactly that. The difficulty is the date. Rock art is stubborn about its age. The carvings have been argued into the Stone Age and argued back out of it toward later centuries, and the argument has not settled. The whales on the rock are certain. The hunt on the rock is probable. The century is anyone's guess, and it is more honest to leave it there. For most coasts, though, and for thousands of years, the whale was less an animal than a kind of weather. Something enormous that happened offshore occasionally, meaning unknown. What people could not approach, they explained. The oldest layer of explanation made it a mouth, the great fish of the Book of Jonah, and it is a fish there. The Hebrew says simply, great fish, and the whale swam into that story later, through Greek translations, and never left. A different layer made it an island. One of the most copied books of the early Middle Ages describes a creature so vast that sailors anchor to its back, gather driftwood, and light a cooking fire, at which the island wakes and dives. And the moral supplied is that the devil works the same way. And the Irish told it gentler. In the Voyage of St. Brendan, written down some 1100 years ago, the monks land on a bare island to celebrate Easter. The island shudders when the kettle boils, and Brendan, unafraid, explains that this is Jasconius, the foremost of all creatures that swim, after which, in the story's loveliest touch, the whale waits for them every year, and every Easter Mass is sung on his back. The same animal, a devil in one book and a parish in the other. Neither author, it is fairly safe to say, had ever been close to one. The first human being in this story who owns a name walks into a king's hall around the year 890. He was called Othere, a chieftain from the far north of Norway, and his account of his home waters was written down at the court of Alfred the Great in England. Most of what he says is dry and believable: walrus ivory, hide rope, the long coast. But one sentence has made scholars clear their throats for 2 centuries. He told the king that he and 5 companions had once killed 60 whales in 2 days. 60 in 2 days with 6 men. Perhaps they were small whales driven ashore in a bay. Perhaps the number grew in the telling. or a copyist's pen slipped. What the sentence proves is not 60 dead whales. It proves that 1,000 years ago, whale catching was already the kind of thing a man bragged about to a king. And the trade the brag belongs to was already old. A surviving record from the year 670 notes 40 great casks of whale oil delivered from the Bay of Biscay coast to the Abbey of Jumièges on the Seine, bought for its lamps. 12 centuries before Parliament defined light as the flame of a whale candle, monks in Normandy were already praying through the dark by exactly that light, one donkey cart load at a time. So a whale on the beach by the early Middle Ages was no longer a mystery. It was property, and it smelled like money, literally so, since a big carcass announces itself a headland away before anyone sees it. A low tide of a smell, oily and enormous, that brings a whole district out of doors. Picture an Icelandic fjord around the year 1000 on such a morning. Boats crossing, children running the tide line, and on the carcass itself men with long knives opening the blubber in strips while the cold air smokes with the heat still coming off the body. Nobody is improvising. The Icelanders wrote whale strandings into their earliest law books with the care other nations spent on murder. Who may cut and how much? What belongs to the man who owns the shore? What must be reported and to whom? They were right to legislate, because a single big carcass could carry a farmstead through the dark half of the year, months of meat and fat, lamp oil, rafters of rib, and windfalls that size are worth fighting over. One of the great sagas hangs a feud on precisely this, neighbours coming to blows on the whale's own back. The word Icelanders used was hovalreki, a whale drift, and 11 centuries later it is still their everyday word for a jackpot, a stroke of outrageous luck. The language remembers what the animal was, fortune, delivered at the sea's whim to be carved by rule. What the shore could not do was ask for one. On an evening of that same age, from a headland above the fjord, a watcher in the grass might see the water swell and part around a long black back, a hill with breath in it, out where the light was failing. It blew once, a soft, carrying sigh, rolled slowly through the last brightness on the water, and went down. The surface closed without a seam. It owed the shore nothing, and the shore knew it, and went back to waiting. A stone lookout stands on the headland above Guetaria, a fishing town on the steep green corner of Spain where the Pyrenees walk into the Atlantic, and in the autumn of a year around 1200 there is a man up in it with nothing to do but attend to the sea. The sound at that height is wind and gull cry and the long grind of water working the rocks below. He isn't admiring the view. The town pays for his eyes. What it is buying is first sight of a double plume of spray standing off the water, the twin V-shaped blow of a heavy whale which hangs in cold air long enough to be counted before it frays. Whole minutes can pass between one breath and the next. He watches the empty sea the way a man watches a door. When it opens, everything below him converts. A smoke fire kindled at the tower was the signal this coast agreed on, smoke by day, flame by night, and by the time it is drawing well, the word is already running downhill from door to door, Balia, whale, and the beach has turned into a launching. Open boats go out through the surf, 6 and 8 oars apiece, the harpooner standing braced in the bows, and what follows is not a battle so much as a piece of terrible seamanship. The iron goes in, the line comes taut, and the whale runs with the boat dragging behind it like a toy on a string, sometimes for hours, until exhaustion brings it within reach of the lances. Men died doing this, in sight of their own church, and the coast kept doing it, because of what waited at the end. This whale, killed, does not sink. It lies on the surface like a capsized hull, and the boats gather it up and row home, towing more wealth in one body than a fishing crew might otherwise touch in years, down to the beach fires, the cutting, the oil going into barrels in the sheds above the tide line. By the time that watchman was born, none of this was new. It was administration. In 1150, when King Sancho the Wise granted the town of San Sebastian its charter, the port's tariff schedule already listed whale products among the goods worth taxing, baleen included. Those fingernail plate curtains from the animal's mouth had a customs category before England had a parliament. The church took its share in kind. Along this coast, the tongue, prized as the choicest cut of the whole animal, customarily went to the church as a tithe, an offering weighing as much as a horse, rendered in meat, and the towns themselves told everyone what they were. When Hondarribia pressed its official seal into wax in 1297, the image it chose was a whale with a harpoon in it. Bermeo, Biarritz and Guetaria signed themselves the same way. A city stamps its identity with a thing it cannot be imagined without. These places, asked to say in one picture what they were, answered, "We are the people who go out." The animal they went out for was the black, slow, barnacle-faced giant they called Sarda, and the English-speaking world would later call the right whale. About that name, honesty requires a short confession. The story everyone tells, that it was the right whale to hunt, slow enough to row down, fat enough to float, appears in no early source. The name simply shows up in print in the 1720s, unexplained, and the tidy reasoning behind it was supplied generations later and repeated until it hardened into fact. It may only ever have meant the true whale, the proper whale, the whale as such. What the word meant to the men who coined it, nobody wrote down, and at this distance nobody can. What needs no etymology are the three facts themselves: it swims slowly, it keeps close to shore, and it floats when dead. Those three facts in a world of oars and hemp made it the only giant on earth a village could take, and so for 500 years, the one all of this kept happening to. The meat, meanwhile, travelled, salted down into what the trade frankly called whale bacon. It went by ship and cart into France, where it had a market with a calendar attached. Through Lent, and on the year's many fast days, the church forbade meat but permitted fish, and the whale, warm-blooded, air-breathing, milk-giving, was ruled to be fish. Aristotle had laid out the reasons it could not be 15 centuries earlier, in a book that never stopped being copied. The menu never heard. So the whale fed precisely the tables that were forbidden everything else, and a coastal people grew a steady export on the strength of a category error. File that ruling away somewhere comfortable. It has not made its last appearance, and in the very decades the Basque towns were pressing whales into wax at the opposite edge of the world. The other half of the craft was crossing the roof of the Arctic. Out of the Bering Strait, moving east through the 1200s, came people whose whole architecture of life was built around the bowhead. The ice-going cousin of the Basques, Sarda, heavier still, insulated like a furnace wall. They hunted from boats of stretched walrus hide, light enough to carry and quiet on the water, with crews of 8 or so, and their harpoon heads were carved to do something iron on a rope cannot: pass through the skin and then turn crosswise inside, so the line held fast no matter how the animal fought, while inflated seal skin floats dragged and tired it at the surface. They roofed their winter houses with the jaws. They lit the polar night with the oil. No charter, no tariff, no seal in wax. The whale was not money there. It was the calendar, the architecture, and the larder in one body. It is also, of everything in this chapter, the one hunt that has never stopped. Between the two coasts, without either knowing the other existed, the whole kit was now assembled. The far north had perfected the crew, and the Bay of Biscay had invented the price. Below the tower at Guetaria, In the season this chapter has been standing in, a cow right whale and her calf ride the swell just inside the bay, slow as loaded barges, so close inshore that on a still night the town can hear them breathe. She works the water with her mouth open, unhurried, armoured in nothing, doing what her line has done since before the pyramids that stand a morning's drive from her ancestors' bones. Resting on her broad back, though she will never know any of it, are a church's tithe, a town's signature, a winter of lamplight, and the Lenten suppers of another country. She is the load-bearing animal of a small civilization, and season by season, at a pace too slow for any single watchman to swear to, there are fewer of her kind inside the circle of water the tower commands, until the day is coming when the men who own the boats will stop asking where this year's whales are and start asking where whales are at all. They found their answer nearly 3,000 miles due west of the watchtowers. In the autumn of 1565, in a narrow harbour on the Labrador shore of the Strait of Belle Isle, a place the charts now call Red Bay, a Basque galleon named the San Juan lay loaded for home with the better part of 1,000 barrels of whale oil in her hold, a season's rendered wealth when a storm came through the anchorage. She dragged, struck, and settled in 10 meters of water. Her people got ashore. In the days that followed, they even fished a share of the barrels back up, because oil like that was not left lying for weather's sake. Then the fleet sailed, ice closed the strait behind it, and the ship began her 4 centuries of being forgotten. The world she sank in the middle of was already a full-grown industry. From the 1530s, Basque ships had been crossing to this strait every summer, roughly 15 of them in an ordinary year, carrying 600 men, in the best seasons more, and they did not come to explore. They came to run about 20 shore stations strung along the coast, and they built them properly. Excavators would later find the Labrador rock littered with red roofing tile shipped out from Spain as ballast, so that for 3 generations a corner of the subarctic wore the roofline of the Bay of Biscay. A working July there began cold and stayed cold. Chalupas, the light whaleboats, 8 men to a boat, worked the tide rips of the strait while the shore crews fed the furnaces, and the trying fires burned so steadily that the smoke lay flattened over the anchorage, and men tasted it in their bread. The water numbs a bare arm in minutes there, even in summer, and much of the work was done to the elbow in it. Some years the ice shut the strait before the ships escaped, and the price of that is still legible. The little cemetery on Saddle Island holds well over 100 of them, buried a long way from Guitaria. What came home justified everything by the arithmetic of the age. On the order of 15,000 barrels a year from this one strait, the yield of some 300 whales, season upon season for 80 years. Europe's lamps and soap kettles drank it without ever asking where it was from. Remembering it fell in the end to one stubborn reader. The fishery slipped almost entirely out of written history, no monuments, no chronicle, but it never left the filing systems, because these were litigious, careful people who insured their cargoes and sued each other with enthusiasm. In the notarial archives of northern Spain, among wills and charter contracts and insurance claims, a Canadian historian named Selma Huxley Barkham spent years in the mid-20th century reassembling the whole enterprise on paper, down to which ships had been lost in which harbours. In 1978, following her directions, divers went down into Red Bay and touched the San Juan. The excavation that followed ran 7 years, and beneath the crushed hull they found something better than treasure. One of the chalupas itself, flattened but complete, the actual 8-meter boat, which conservators spent years unpicking and steadying. The site now carries a World Heritage listing, and the small boat lies in the Interpretation Centre a few hundred meters from where it last worked. Then the bones on those beaches were finally asked to testify, and they contradicted everyone. The settled account, repeated across a century of scholarship, held that the Basques of the Strait had taken right whales and bowheads in roughly equal shares, and that this was the blow that broke the North Atlantic right whale, the reason it has been scarce ever since. In 2004, geneticists sampled 21 whale bones from the old stations, 13 of which had been identified by shape as right whale. The DNA came back 20 bowheads, 1 right whale. A wider study followed, 218 bones from 16 sites, and the answer barely moved, 203 bowheads and still that same single right whale. The catch had been the Arctic cousin almost entirely. The accusation had the wrong species in it. There's a particular feeling that comes from watching a certainty older than everyone who held it dissolve in a season of lab work, and it is worth banking now because everything ahead runs on documents, and documents can all agree with one another and all be wrong. The lone right whale bone delivered its own verdict too. Every genetic marker it carries still circulates in the living population. The right whale's famous poverty of blood is older than the fishery that was supposed to have caused it. While the strait was being emptied, a second rush opened at the top of the map. Dutch navigators hunting a sea route to China had blundered instead onto the islands of Spitsbergen, and the bays there proved to be full of bowheads. English ships began working them in 1611. The Dutch chartered a company for the purpose in 1614, and by around 1620 there stood on a black gravel beach at 79 degrees north, a Dutch trying station whose name translates without apology as Blubber Town. What later centuries did to that place is a small comedy of sources. A chronicler writing in 1720, who never went, promoted it to half a city. The whaling scientist Scoresby, a century on, gave it 12 to 18,000 inhabitants. By the 1920s, the retellings had added gambling dens and women, a boom town of sin among the icebergs. Archaeologists finally dug it in 1979 and counted what had actually been there. About 200 men in the best summers, 19 buildings, 7 or 8 double furnaces, 101 graves, and no trace of a woman anywhere. One detail of the legend, though, held up, and it is the loveliest one. There really was a bakery, and when the loaves came out, a bell rang across the beach, and whalemen at the edge of the polar ice walked up the gravel toward the smell of fresh bread. The Dutch also did the one thing that makes their rush knowable. They counted. In the single season of 1684, 246 Dutch ships took 1,185 whales. What Othere had boasted of to a king was now about a fortnight's work for a fleet. And the counting exposes the shape of the thing. The bays went quiet within a generation, so the ships followed the whales to the ice edge. The ice edge thinned, so they pushed west toward Greenland and later into the Davis Strait. Each move a longer voyage, treated not as a warning but as geography. Before those grounds were done, the recorded kill alone passed 140,000 bowheads, and the records are a floor, not a ceiling. Nobody wrote an obituary for any of it, at home or in the north. The Biscay Towers went slowly out of use in these same lifetimes, watchmen unposted, boats sold, and the bays of Spitsbergen simply stopped answering. The industry's compass had been set, and it would not change for as long as there was whaling. When a ground goes silent, sail farther. Under the ice edge, meanwhile, the animal itself went on as before, farther in than the ships could follow. A bowhead carries close to 0.5 meter of blubber and can break through sea ice with the crown of its skull to open its own breathing holes. Its baleen hangs in plates longer than a man is tall, and its heart, by every sign the biologists now trust, can keep time for 2 centuries. Sit with that number against this chapter. a calf swimming beside its mother when the first English ships anchored at Spitzbergen could, at the far edge of what its body allows, still have been alive, an old, scarred animal under the dark of the pack, when the fires on the beaches had all gone out and the fishery that opened this chapter had died of emptiness. Everything described here, the tile roofs and the baker's bell and the 246 ships, fits inside one possible lifetime of the animal it was all about. The first man hired to bring whaling to Nantucket never, so far as the record shows, turned up for work. In 1672, the town, a low sand island off Massachusetts with thin soil and long winters, voted an arrangement with one James Loper of Long Island to come and carry on a design of whale catching, land and privileges included. The agreement survives. The man does not appear again. The next act in the island's own telling is a Cape Cod whaleman named Ichabod Paddock, brought over around 1690 to teach the trade, though the first anyone wrote that down was 145 years later, and the crown of the legend is Christopher Hussey, blown offshore in a gale around 1712, who found himself among strange square-headed whales and killed one, a story first recorded by the island's own historian in 1835, who added with a candour his repeaters have not always kept, that the date was not fully ascertained. So what would the first sperm whale even mean? Shorefolk had been cutting up drift specimens for generations. Bermuda had taken some. The more time anyone spends in the records, the less the question holds its shape. What the customs books show, plainly, is this. By 1715, half a dozen little Nantucket sloops were working the deep water on purpose and coming home with something new. The animal they had found was nothing like the slow coastal giants of the towers and the ice. This one was a hunter of the deep ocean, a squid-eater that goes down where the light gives out entirely and stays down the better part of an hour, throwing sound ahead of itself from that organ of oil and echo first met 50 million years back. A third of its length is head, and the head is the point. Cut into the top of it, and there is the case, a reservoir of fine, clear oil, 500 gallons of it in a big bull, which early anatomists mistook for the animal's seed, an error now fossilized in the name spermaceti and in sperm whale itself. What mattered on the wharf was what the stuff did. Chilled through in a New England winter, the head matter sets. Pressed, it parts into a limpid oil and a hard pearl-white wax. Nobody handling it had the faintest idea it was the workings of a living sonar. They knew what it fetched, because the wax made a candle unlike anything else for sale in the 18th century. Ordinary light then meant tallow, rendered animal fat that bent and guttered, fouled the air, needed constant trimming, and stank of the stockyard it came from. A spermaceti candle was hard and cool to the touch, burned with a white, upright, nearly smokeless flame, and held its rate so steadily that brightness itself could later be defined in law as one such candle, 6 to the pound. The knack of making them reached Massachusetts by 1749, when one Benjamin Crabbe petitioned for exclusive rights. The exclusivity evaporated the way trade secrets do, and the craft settled in Rhode Island in Obadiah Brown's Providence Works from 1753, and in Newport with Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, a Sephardic Jewish merchant whose family had come out of Inquisition Iberia by way of the Caribbean and who became the great name in American candlemaking. In pressing season, the workrooms ran cold on purpose, shutters open to January, screw presses groaning down on sacks of straw-coloured matter, the air faintly sweet with oil, and on the bench, always, one of the house's own candles burning white, and even while the rest of the town made do with tallow's orange stammer. The crates went out stenciled for Boston, for the West Indies, for London. There was so much money in that whiteness that the makers did what makers of a good thing so often do. On the 5th of November 1761, the leading houses, 8 or 9 firms, Quaker Browns and Newport Sephardim together, signed quiet articles as the United Company of Spermaceti Chandlers, fixing the top price any of them would pay for head matter, fixing the price of candles, and parceling out the supply. It was a price-fixing ring, polite and thorough, a full century before Americans coined a word for such arrangements, and its paperwork survives. So does one procedural detail with a whole world folded inside it. The Combine did no business on Saturdays out of respect for Rivera's Sabbath. Men whose families had crossed oceans to keep their Sabbaths unmolested, friends and Jews, neither of them welcome in the old world's guilds, sat down together in the new one and rigged the market for light. The island feeding them grew into something Europe had to reckon with. By the early 1770s, Nantucket alone was sending out on the order of 150 vessels, and its whalemen ranged so far that Edmund Burke, rising in Parliament in 1775 to explain the American temperament, reached for them as his evidence. No sea, he told the House, but is vexed by their fishery. Within months, that same Parliament's war fell on the island like a dropped spar. Ships burned, taken, rotting at blockaded wharves, the London market sealed shut, and a community of pacifists starving on its sandbar between two navies. It took the peace of 1783 and years after it to refloat the trade. But refloat it did, and by the new century the pursuit of the sperm whale was becoming what the pursuit of the right whale and the bowhead had been before it. Except that this time the finest product in the business was American, and the lamps of 2 continents were bidding for it, which is how a whale ended up on trial in New York City. State law required fish oil to be inspected and gauged at a fee per cask. An inspector named James Maurice discovered that a merchant named Samuel Judd had bought 3 casks of spermaceti oil uninspected and sued him for the $75 penalty. The whole question turned on whether whale oil was fish oil, whether a whale is a fish. And for 3 days over the new year of 1818 into 1819 in the mayor's court, the city packed the benches for a tax case dressed as a question of nature. The defense produced Samuel Latham Mitchell, physician, senator, professor, New York's one-man academy, who testified that a whale is no more a fish than a man. Warm blood, lungs, live birth, milk, the whole inventory, settled among naturalists since Linnaeus had shelved the whales with the mammals 60 years before. Opposing counsel answered with Jonah, with the dictionary, and with the plain speech of every wharf in the harbour, where men who had actually killed whales called them fish and always had. The jury was out 15 minutes. The whale was a fish. Maurice got his $75. Once again, lent tables first, now a courtroom, the whale was legally a fish exactly where money most needed it to be, though commerce, having won, promptly changed its mind. Within weeks, the legislature exempted whale oil from the fish oil law by name, and the finest lighting fluid in the world went back to moving uninspected. The label had lost, the trade had won. The animal had not been consulted either way. That same winter night, out past the last sounding line of the Atlantic shelf, a bull sperm whale is hunting a mile down in water, colder and darker than any courtroom, pulsing his voice into the black ahead of him and reading what comes back. Above his jaw rides a case of oil worth more per gallon. On the street, the juryman walked home along than anything else a lamp can burn. Streets lit, some of them, with exactly this. None of it reaches him. He has never in his life been nearer to land than deep water lets him, and everything about him that people prize is out here with him, where he lives, which meant that the people who wanted it were going to have to come out here too, past the shelf, past the chart's soundings, into the open desert of the sea, and stay out for years at a time. There was a piece of ocean the Nantucket men had only just learned to name, the offshore ground, a belt of whale-rich water discovered 2 years earlier, 1,000 miles west of Peru and about as far from land as it is possible to be on this planet. On the morning of the 20th of November, 1820, it lay almost calm. The ship working it was the Essex, elderly, small for the trade, and considered lucky, 87 feet of oak that had been 15 months out from Nantucket, with 20 men aboard and her boats down among a shoal of sperm whales. Her first mate, Owen Chase, was back on deck mending a boat a whale's tail had cracked an hour before, which is the only reason there was a careful pair of eyes on the ship at all. And a little way off the bow, a bull surfaced, enormous even by the standards of men who measured such animals for a living. Chase would call him 85 feet. No sperm whale ever measured has come close to that, and no man watching what happened next was reaching for a tape. What the record can say is that he was very large and very close, and that for a while he simply lay there in the swell, blowing, doing nothing at all. Then he moved, not away, at the ship, quickening as he came, and the first blow arrived through the hull the way earthquakes arrive through floors. Chase wrote that she brought up as suddenly and violently as if she had struck a rock. The boy at the helm, Thomas Nickerson, 14 years old, felt it through the tiller. 60 years on, he would still be writing it down. The whale passed beneath, rose alongside, seemed for a time stunned by his own collision, and then, from dead ahead, he came a second time, at twice his ordinary speed, with his head half out of the water, and drove it into the bows. Planking 2 inches thick went in like basket work. He backed clear, made off to leeward, and the Essex began to die. Within minutes she lay over on her side, her crew stringing together what had happened out of noise, the concussion, the grind of him going under the keel, and now the sea talking to itself in the hold. The boats came racing back to a sight none of their trades had prepared. Not a ship in trouble, but a ship concluded. Chase, groping afterward for what he had seen in the animal's manner, wrote that it carried fury and vengeance in his aspect, a whaleman's reading, made in the worst hour of his life, and the only eyewitness verdict we have. They rode the wreck for 2 days, cutting into her for hard bread and fresh water, and a small flock of Galapagos tortoises, rigging masts and scraps of sail onto 3 open whaleboats. Then came the decision that turned a disaster into one of the sea's black legends. The nearest refuge, the islands to the west, lay perhaps 1,200 miles downwind, a few weeks sailing. But the islands, the officers believed, held cannibals. The coast of South America lay the better part of 2,000 miles away, much of it against wind and current. And yet, that was the vote. Captain George Pollard was for the islands, his mates were not, and he yielded. 20 men, afraid of being eaten by strangers, steered away from every human being in the Pacific and out into the emptiest water on Earth. The bookkeeping of the 3 months that followed is quiet, and the quiet is the horror of it. A month brought them to Henderson Island, a shelf of coral with a seep of fresh water in the rocks. They stripped it of birds and eggs inside a week, and when the boats went on, 3 men chose to stay behind on the bare rock rather than get back in. In January, the deaths began. The second mate first, buried at sea in the old way. Then the third boat, with 3 men in it, disappeared one night and was never seen again. Then the food arithmetic went where it was always going, and the burials stopped. The accounts render this in the flattest language they own: who died, what was done, in what order. And what stops a reader is not what they record, but what they decline to dramatize. 7 of the dead were eaten. The first 4 to die and be used that way were the 4 black sailors of the crew, a sequence the survivors' narratives pass over without comment, and later historians have not. and on the 1st of February, in the captain's boat, with no one dead and nothing left, they drew lots. The short straw went to Owen Coffin, 17 years old, the captain's own first cousin, whose mother Pollard had promised to look after him. As the survivors told it, Pollard offered to take the boy's place, and Coffin refused him, said his lot was as fair as any, laid his head on the gunwale, and Charles Ramsdell, his friend, who had drawn the second straw, did what the lot required. Rescue, when it came in pieces. On the 18th of February, a London brig raised Chase's boat, 3 men alive in it, 90 days out from the wreck. 5 days later, the whale ship Dauphin, of Nantucket of all ports on earth, came upon the captain's boat. Pollard and Ramsdell, 95 days out, alive among the bones of their shipmates, and at first unwilling to be parted from them. In April, a passing ship took the 3 men off Henderson, still alive on shellfish and luck. 8 of the 20 had survived. 3 months and a week in open boats, nearly 4,000 miles of drift and sail, and behind them, on the offshore ground, an old ship settling somewhere below the reach of any story but this one. Nantucket took its men back and did not much discuss the details, and the details did not need discussing to travel. Every wharf in the world's whaling ports came to know what the Essex men had done and what a whale had done first. Pollard went to sea again. The island gave him another ship, and in February of 1823 he lost her too, on a reef west of Hawaii, where divers finally identified her scattered ironwork almost 2 centuries later. Twice wrecked, he was finished. The wharves had an old word for such a man, and the word was Jonah. He lived out his life as Nantucket's night watchman, the man who had commanded the open Pacific, walking the lamplit streets after midnight, trying doors. He never hid what had happened in the boat. Asked about it once by a visiting missionary, he told the whole of it plainly, and then stopped himself with a sentence that has outlived everything else. "My head," he said, "is on fire at the recollection." Did the whale mean it? Chase never doubted. Others, in the sober years after, preferred an accident, a half-ton misjudgment by a panicked animal dressed up by traumatized men. For 2 centuries it stayed a matter of taste. Then, in 2016, engineers built a structural model of the sperm whale's forehead and found that its strange internal architecture, the oil case riding above a lattice of partitioned tissue, spreads and absorbs exactly the kind of load a head-on ramming delivers. The machine can do it deliberately and survive. Whether that machine chose to, on that particular morning, is locked inside the one witness who knew. But there is a wider answer, and it may be the more unsettling one. Researchers who combed the digitized logbooks of the whole American fleet found that in ground after newly opened ground, the whalemen's strike rate collapsed, down by more than half within a few years of their arrival, faster than the killing alone can explain. If the analysis holds, sperm whales were learning the ships and learning them from each other, which way to run, when to go deep, how to live near the new thing that hunted them. The Essex met one animal. The fleet, it seems, was being answered by a society. As for the bull himself, the record ends where Chase's eyes did, a dark back making off to leeward, unhurried, trailing broken plank. No later ship reported him, no carcass, no scars matched, no name given. He came up out of unrecorded water and went back into it, and the sea he closed behind him has kept the secret ever since. Evening in the New Bedford of the 1840s was a municipal performance. Lamplighters worked up County Street past banks got up like Greek temples, past shipowners' mansions with whale oil light coming warm through the parlour glass, and a young whaleman who walked these streets would later set down the town's secret in one line. All these brave houses and flowery gardens, he wrote, were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. People still repeat that New Bedford was then the richest city per head on the face of the earth. Nobody has ever produced the ledger that proves it, and the town hardly needs the loan of a superlative because the documented numbers are strange enough. In 1846, the United States sent out 735 whaling vessels. The rest of the world combined mustered barely 200. Roughly 4 of every 5 whale ships on the planet flew one flag, and the busiest wharves in that fleet ran along this one Massachusetts harbor. Figures that come down to us not from boosters but from customs collectors' books and the owner's own agents, records kept by men with no reason on earth to flatter them. Down on those wharves, the first thing that reached a stranger was the smell. Oil was in everything, in the wharf timbers, in the coils of new whale line, in the cooper's shavings, in the wool of every coat. A heavy, sweetish presence that visitors wrinkled at, and residents had long since translated accurately into prosperity. Under the forest of masts, an outfitting ship took on her world for 3 years. Thousands of barrel staves, boats stacked in nests, bread, beef, iron, and rolling casks along those wharves in 1838 was a 20-year-old fugitive from slavery in Maryland who had chosen this port precisely because a black man could get wages here. Frederick Douglass was a trained ship caulker, and the white caulkers of New Bedford refused to work beside him. That colour line he records without decoration. So the future statesman took what the harbour offered, stowing oil, sawing wood, sweeping chimneys, rolling casks. Of his first coin earned, he wrote simply that the reward was entirely his own. No master stood between him and his money. The whale city was no paradise. It was something more specific, the place where the wages of the lamp trade were real enough to be worth guarding. Who crewed the 700 ships is its own map of the world. In the trade's early American decades, roughly 1 man in 5 before the mast was black. Whaling paid badly enough and killed impartially enough to be one of the few integrated industries the Republic had, though after 1830 the share thinned as owners took on men from the Azores and Cape Verde, shipped mid-ocean on the outward leg. Nobody aboard drew a wage. Every soul from captain to cabin boy worked for a lay, a fixed fraction of the voyage's final worth. A captain might have a 15th, a skilled harpooner a 75th, a green hand 1/200th part, less the outfitter's bill for his clothes and knife and bedding, which is how a boy could sail 3 years around the world and land, with paperwork to prove it, owing money. And because the voyages now ran 3 and 4 years, the nearer grounds no longer answering, a fact worth remembering later, the ships began carrying households. By mid-century, about 1 whaler in 6 sailed with the captain's wife aboard, and some with children born between oceans. One of them, Mary Brewster of Stonington, Connecticut, went out in 1845 and kept her journal faithfully through years of Pacific whaling. Published a century and a half later, it records the industry from the cabin doorway, weather, sail-making, barrels, grief, the slow arithmetic of distance, the whale fishery as a woman's daily life rather than an adventure. The work itself, out on the grounds, was mostly a discipline of watching. 2-hour tricks at the masthead hoops, 100 feet up, eyes moving along the rim of the world, days and weeks of nothing, which is when the carving happened. Sperm whale teeth worked with sail needles into hearts, ships and women's faces, the sailor's art called scrimshaw, made of boredom and homesickness in about equal parts. Then a dawn comes flat and glassy, and before any lookout sings out, the deck hears it. A long, breathy sigh out of the half-dark, then another beside it, the sound of great animals surfacing unhurried on still water. Light finds them. A family of sperm whales logging together, calves against their mother's flanks, the same tight societies the logbooks were unknowingly mapping. The cry goes up, the boats go down, and if an iron holds, 6 men discover what the trade politely called a Nantucket sleigh ride, a 40-ton animal towing their boat faster than any crew of oarsmen ever moved one, the bow hissing, spray sheeting back, a mile of line ready to run. Men left accounts of it, written half in terror and half in something uncomfortably close to joy. What came home in the casks went everywhere the century was going. The year 1843 alone landed some 167,000 barrels of sperm oil in American ports. Stand those casks shoulder to shoulder, and they would line the road from these wharves to Boston. And the buyers were no longer only lamp sellers. The cotton mills bought it, because spindles turning at speed wanted an oil that would not gum or freeze, and nothing matched it. The watch trade bought finer still. From 1844, a New Bedford man named Ezra Kelly was refining oil from the jaws of blackfish, the little black pilot whales, into the most delicate lubricant in America, drops of it destined for watch pivots and, in time, for the finest instruments the country made. Corset makers and umbrella men took the baleen, and now and then a lucky ship sold the strangest cargo in commerce. Ambergris, a grey, waxy mass that grows in a sperm whale's gut around the beaks of squid it cannot digest, worth more than its weight in gold in some markets, and destined for perfume. The scent trade's way of making fragrance cling to skin. Light, motion, fashion, timekeeping, scent. An entire material civilization drawn from one family of animals. And in all that magnificent bookkeeping, lays, barrels, insurance, candle boxes, there is one ledger nobody anywhere thought to keep. No column in any counting house on earth tracked how many whales were left. At nightfall, the products of the trade performed their daily miracle in 100,000 rooms at once. In a mill town, the spindles spun on their film of sperm oil. In a parlour in Ohio or Yorkshire, a match touched a wick and the clean light stood up in the glass. A watch ticked on its single drop of jaw oil in a vest pocket. Piece by piece, an ordinary evening of the industrial age. The sewing finished, the letter written, the child's page read aloud, was being held up from below by an animal swimming in darkness on the far side of the planet, present in every room and thought of in none of them. 7 cents. By the middle of the 1890s, that bought a gallon of lamp fuel in America, the new fuel, the rock oil distillate called kerosene. And the lamp it went into stood on the same parlour tables, under the same evening rituals, that sperm oil had been lighting for 100 years. At its peak price, in 1856, sperm oil had sold for $1.77 the gallon. Between those two numbers lies the death of the whale light age, and almost everything commonly said about that death is slightly, importantly, wrong. The story everyone carries is tidy. Drake struck oil in Pennsylvania in August 1859, kerosene poured forth, and petroleum saved the whales. The account books tell it differently. The American whaling fleet reached its greatest size in 1846, 13 years before Drake's well, and shrank almost every year afterward. By the early 1850s, the biggest selling lamp fuel in the country was probably not whale oil at all, but camphene, a cheap turpentine spirit with a nasty habit of exploding, while the better city houses were piping in coal gas. Then California happened. From 1849, whole crews jumped ship for the goldfields, and whale ships swung abandoned at anchor in San Francisco Bay. Wages ashore were climbing, money invested in mills and railroads returned more than money soaked into 4-year voyages. The economists who eventually audited the collapse concluded that the emptying of the whale grounds mattered, either not at all or too late. The industry was dying of competition before kerosene arrived to deliver the finishing stroke. How to weigh those causes, gold against gas, against wages, against the thinning sea, is still argued. What no serious audit supports is the comfortable version, the one where the oil well rides in like a rescue. Petroleum did not save the whales. It merely relieved them of one duty, and the Century had others in mind. It was in these same years that the trade acquired its epitaph, though nobody recognized it at the time. The young whaleman whose line about harpooned houses we borrowed for New Bedford was Herman Melville, who had shipped out of Fairhaven across the river in January 1841 aboard the whaler Acushnet. 10 years later came the novel, The Whale in London, that October, where the printers managed to drop the epilogue so that baffled reviewers demanded to know how a story with no survivor came to be told, and Moby-Dick in New York in November of 1851. Its white whale had a real ancestor in print, a magazine yarn from 1839 about a scarred old bull off Chile called Mocha-Dick, white as wool and bristling with rusted irons, a first mate's fireside story, half legend already, and the sea supplied the book's launch with an advertisement no publisher could buy. 12 weeks before the American edition, the New Bedford whale ship Anne Alexander was rammed and sunk by a sperm whale on the Pacific grounds, the first such loss since the Essex, and Melville, hearing of it, wrote to a friend, "Ye gods, what a commentator is this Anne Alexander whale! I wonder if my evil art has raised this monster." Whalemen later swore the same whale was taken months afterward with her timbers still in its blubber. That part is reported, not proved. What the publisher's ledger proves is crueler. About 3,200 American copies sold in Melville's whole lifetime, and $556.37 in royalties. The greatest book the industry would ever get failed alongside the industry itself, and was rediscovered by a Century that had already lost the fleet. One more thing belongs here. In the summer of 1852, Melville visited Nantucket and was introduced to an elderly night watchman, George Pollard, once of the Essex. In pencil, in his own copy of Chase's narrative, Melville recorded the meeting. To the islanders, he wrote, "The man was a nobody. To me, the most impressive man, though wholly unassuming, even humble, that I ever encountered." Then the war came for the ships themselves twice, once as a weapon, once as prey. In November 1861, the government bought 24 worn-out whalers, loaded them with Massachusetts fieldstone, and sailed them south under naval orders. In December, they were scuttled in rows across the main shipping channel of Charleston Harbor, with 20 more sunk in a neighboring channel that January. The fleet that had lit the world was spent as a cork to plug a rebel port. 4 years later, at the other end of the earth, came the reckoning in reverse. The Confederate raider Shenandoah, hunting the Yankee whale fleet, reached the Bering Strait in June of 1865, 11 weeks after Appomattox. Aboard captured prizes, her officers found April newspapers that told them both things at once, that Richmond had fallen and Lee had surrendered, and that the war would somehow go on. They chose to believe the second, and in 6 days took some 24 whale ships, crowding the crews aboard a few spared vessels and burning the rest. On the 28th of June alone, 10 ships went up in under 8 hours, pyres standing on a bright, windless sea in the endless daylight of the Arctic summer, ash sifting down on the ice. Not until the 2nd of August, stopped by a British bark with unarguable news, did Captain James Waddell accept that his country had ceased to exist months before. He struck his guns below, sailed 17,000 miles to Liverpool without showing his flag, and hauled it down for the last time that November. The final shots of the American Civil War, fired 10 weeks after it ended, were fired at whalemen. The Arctic finished what the war had started. The Bowhead Fleet's habit was to work the narrow lead of open water along Alaska's northwest shore, gambling each September on the pack ice standing off. In 1871, the wind turned, and the ice came in instead. 33 ships were pinned between Point Belcher and Wainwright, grinding, holed, going nowhere, with winter arriving. And on the 14th of September, the assembled captains did an extraordinary thing. They drew up and signed a formal protocol, a document that survives, certifying to their owners and insurers that no choice remained. Then 1,219 people, crews, plus the wives and children of the household ships, went over the side into open whaleboats and made their way some 70 miles along the ice edge to 7 ships standing off Icy Cape. The 7 poured their own hard-won oil over the side to make room and took aboard every single soul. Not one life was lost. $1.5 million of ships and cargo stayed behind in the ice, and New Bedford's Arctic trade never truly stood up again. When a dozen more ships were caught 5 years later, about 50 men who stayed with them died, and the lesson was complete. And the whales themselves? The counting the era never did was finally done a century later, stitched out of the surviving logbooks, and the reconstructions, with their honest wide margins, run like this. Roughly 270,000 sperm whales taken worldwide in the sailing century. 20 to 30,000 right whales killed in the North Pacific in the 1840s alone, with fewer than half the animals struck ever actually secured. Some 18,500 bowheads out of the Western Arctic after 1848. And in the winter of 1857, a captain with the unimprovable name of Charles Melville Scammon worked his brig into a Baja California lagoon and found the grey whale's nursery, the sheltered water where the mothers calved. The lagoon hunts that followed were close, ugly work. Cows whose calves were struck turned on the boats and stove them, and the whaleman's name for the species was devilfish, an accusation the circumstances might reasonably have reversed. Around 8,000 greys died along that coast in a generation. Scammon, to his own credit and history's lasting confusion, then sat down and wrote the finest natural history of Pacific whales his century produced, a book that failed commercially in 1874 and is quoted by biologists to this day. The trade's best witness turned out to be one of its most effective killers, and he seems to have understood both facts. Even then, the hunt did not quite die. It shrank to a single stubborn market. Lamps no longer wanted the bowhead, but corsets did. Whalebone climbed from 32 cents a pound in 1870 to over $5 by 1892, until a big bowhead was worth thousands in bone before anyone rendered a drop of oil. And so a remnant steam fleet kept working the ice for fashion's sake until spring steel and changing dress lines killed the market around 1908. After that, the endings came in single file. The Bark Wanderer, the port's last square-rigged whaler, sailed from New Bedford in August 1924 and wrecked on the rocks off Cuttyhunk Island the following day, one day out. In 1927, the little schooner John R. Manta came home, and no one followed her, and there were old men on that wharf who could remember 700 sail, the whole rise and the whole ruin held inside single living memories. Take the inventory of what remained of the enterprise that had lit the world: a wreck on a home water reef, one schooner, a novel that had sold 3,000 copies, and, far to the north under the ice, 33 abandoned ships slowly being taken apart by the thing they had gambled against. The lamps burned on regardless, filled now from the ground at 7 cents the gallon, and the whale, for the first time in a century, had no obvious job. It would not be unemployed for long. The next employer was already at sea. In those same summer weeks of 1865, when the Yankee fleet was burning in the Bering Strait, a heavy-set, white-bearded Norwegian in his 50s was steaming along the Finnmark coast at the top of Europe, watching whales he could not catch, His name was Sven Foyn of Tønsberg, and he had made himself one of Norway's richest men in the Arctic sealing trade. He was famously severely devout, a man who funded missions, kept the Sabbath-like law, and regarded the wealth of the northern seas, by every account of him, as provision set out for Norway's poor coast by God himself. The ship under his feet was small, iron-hearted, and entirely new in the history of this subject. A purpose-built steam whale catcher, launched in 1863 and working her first seasons in the mid-60s, and he had named her Spes et Fides, Hope and Faith. Off the bow, unhurried, the objects of both went by. Fin whales, slate-grey backs nearly the length of his vessel, rising and blowing and falling with the ease of animals that had never once, in the whole history of whaling, needed to be afraid. Because for 400 years the industry had lived off a technicality. Everything it had ever caught, the slow coastal whale of the Basques, the ice whale, the deep-diving sperm, was either slow enough to row down or obliging enough to float when killed, and usually both. The rorquals were neither. The fast, pleat-throated family, the blue whale, the fin, the sei, cruise at speeds no pulling boat could touch and sprint past 20 knots, and when a rorqual dies, it sinks. Most of the whale flesh on Earth was locked up in species no whaler had ever landed, guarded not by remoteness, but by physics. The sailing age had taken the slow lanes of the ocean and left the fast ones untouched, the way a fishery might work a river's edges for centuries without ever holding the main current. Foyn spent most of a decade breaking that guarantee, and the record of those seasons is a comedy of expensive failure. Harpoons that bent, lines that parted like thread against 40 tons of accelerating animal, whales killed and lost to the bottom. What he patented in 1870 was not a weapon so much as a system, 5 answers bolted into one small ship. Steam to hold close. His catcher could never outrun a fin whale, but she did not need to. She needed a few boat lengths. A cannon in the bows, throwing a heavy harpoon whose tip carried a grenade on a time fuse, so that seconds after the barb set, the charge burst deep inside. A line running not to a tub, but through blocks hung on massive springs below deck, the accumulator, the quiet genius of the thing, which turned the entire vessel into a fisherman's rod, giving and gathering against every run so the line never took a killing snap. A steam winch to do what no crew's arms could, and for the sinking, an air hose, the dead whale pumped taut and buoyant, flagged and left riding the swell to be collected. Aboard, the experience of it was new to the world, the deck trembling underfoot with the engine's shiver, the gun's report slamming from rock wall to rock wall down a fjord, the line roaring out, and then, from inside the sea, a deep, muffled thump with no precedent in nature. His diary holds a sentence the industry's historians have printed ever since. "I thank thee, O Lord, thou alone hast done all." Which day he wrote it, over which whale or contract or deliverance, has never been pinned down. The diary survives, the occasion does not, and what actually moved in the old man as that first grenade went off is one more thing the record declines to hand over. What followed on that coast was the old pattern run at machine speed from a stencil 4 centuries deep. Stations spread along the Finnmark shore, catches multiplied, and between 1868 and 1904, the industry took, by the standard reckonings, on the order of 17 or 18,000 large whales off northern Norway. By the 1890s, the catches were thinning, a curve the Basques and the Dutch would have recognized at a glance, and the companies were already probing outward to Iceland, to the Faroes, to Shetland and Newfoundland, carrying the cannon with them like a patented plague. But the strangest turn of the Norwegian chapter belongs to the fishermen. The coastal cod and capelin fisheries of Finnmark began failing badly in those same years, and the fishermen had a theory. It was the whalers' doing. Whales, they argued from lifetimes of watching, drove the capelin shoals inshore, and the cod followed the capelin, and the fishery followed the cod. Strip the coast of whales, and the whole procession stayed out at sea. The men of science mostly waved this away. The fishermen stopped arguing. On the first 2 days of June 1903, more than 1,000 of them descended on the whaling station at Mehamn, a village on the Barents coast, and took it apart, buildings, gear, the season, thoroughly enough that the government shipped soldiers north. And then, remarkably enough, the government gave the rioters what they wanted. In 1904, the Parliament in Christiania banned whaling off Norway's 3 northern counties for 10 years. Pause on what that was. The first anti-whaling law on Earth was written not to save whales, but to save fish, won by men with crowbars who killed whales' killers for the whales' role in their own economy. The animals were bystanders to their own reprieve. Whether the fishermen's ecology was strictly right is still debated. What can be said is that they were asking a question. What does a sea do when its largest animals are subtracted? That nobody official had yet thought worth asking, and one that, from here forward, never goes away. So stood matters in 1904, a mature, restless industry, flush with capital and grievance, holding the most efficient killing system ever pointed at an animal, and banned from its own home coast, with every ground within reach of a coaling station already thinning. Note what this new whaling was not. It owed almost nothing to the Yankee fleet dying of old age across the Atlantic. Different nation, different species, different tool, different customers. Not romance and lamplight, but steam, grenades, and industrial oil for soap boilers. The old trade and the new one barely touched except in this. Both needed whales in numbers, and the North Atlantic was running out of the kind the cannon wanted. What the system required now was an ocean no whaler had ever worked, and there was exactly one of those left on the planet, far down at the bottom of the charts, cold beyond anything in the industry's experience, and so full of rorquals that the first men to see it would struggle to be believed. Off the North Cape, meanwhile, in the long grey light, a fin whale comes up the way her kind has come up for 1,000,000 years. The blow, the endless slide of back, the small fin arriving last like an afterthought, and then the long submarine glide with the throat pleats folded and the whole animal drawn like a bow. She is the second largest creature the planet has ever produced, and very possibly the fastest thing of her size in the history of life, built by the same Ice Age seas that built the giants. Her speed still works exactly as it always has. The water still parts for it, the distance still opens. It simply no longer protects her from anything, and there is no way for a body to know when its oldest answer has stopped being one. She runs on at the old speed, through the old sea, magnificent and current and obsolete, like a masterpiece finished the week the museum burned down. On Christmas Eve of 1904, on a mountainous island 1,000 miles east and south of Cape Horn, the first oil ran warm out of a brand new set of cookers, and the last untouched ocean on Earth joined the trade. The island was South Georgia, sub-Antarctic, glacier-hung, without a native tree or a permanent inhabitant, and the little harbour was called Grytviken, Pot Cove, after the rusted trypots earlier sealers had left on its beach, as if the place had been holding the name open for what was coming. The man behind it was Carl Anton Larsen, a Norwegian whaling captain who had first seen these waters hunting seals and reconnoitring in the 1890s, and then seen them again the hard way. The polar expedition ship he captained was crushed by pack ice in 1903, and an Argentine corvette carried the survivors to Buenos Aires. At a dinner given there in his honor, Larsen, so the story is told, in English rougher than the sentiment, said that he had seen whales down south in their hundreds and thousands and asked why nobody was taking them. Argentine money took the question seriously. A company was founded on the leap day of 1904. 2 ships reached South Georgia that November, and 5 weeks later the cookers were running. Foyne's cannon had found its ocean. What the first seasons were like strains belief and does not need to be helped. The station's opening year took nearly 200 whales, and about 95% of them were killed within sight of the buildings. No searching, hardly any steaming. The catchers worked the bay the way a man might net a stocked pond. Blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks in processional numbers. Everything the North Atlantic had spent 40 years thinning was here in original density, unhunted since the beginning of the world. 6 more stations rose along that coast within a decade. By 1912, Grytviken, at full production, was a place without parallel anywhere. Whales the length of the workshops hauled out on a plane of planking, men in spiked boots opening them in blanket strips. Flensing, the trade called it. Steam-driven saws going through jawbones, winches dragging half a ribcage uphill through crowds of screaming giant petrels, and over all of it, the smell, dense, sweet, meaty, unforgettable, rendering smoke and blood-warm steam pouring off the cookers into freezing air. The men who worked there wrote of that smell the way soldiers write of mud. As the medium, the whole experience came packed in. Then the wider world discovered what the oil was worth in wartime. Glycerin is a byproduct of splitting fats. Nitroglycerin is made from glycerin, and the propellant in British shells was made from nitroglycerin. Whale oil, it turned out, was among the best feedstocks there was. From 1916, Britain moved to buy up virtually the entire Norwegian production at controlled prices for the duration. And across the war years, somewhere between 58 and 80,000 whales, the count depends on who is doing the counting, were rendered for the Allied war effort. It is a strange line to write plainly, but it is plain fact. Some measurable fraction of the Western Front's gunfire was fired out of the bodies of Antarctic whales. Peace found an even bigger customer, breakfast. Back in 1902, a German chemist named Wilhelm Norman had patented a way of hardening liquid oils with hydrogen, and what began as a soap maker's trick matured, with refining and deodorizing, into food. Hardened, whitened and churned, whale oil became margarine, cheap butter for industrial Europe. And by the 1930s, the overwhelming majority of the world's whale oil was not being burned at all. It was being eaten. The great buyer was Unilever, formed in 1929 precisely at the junction of soap and margarine, which contracted for entire Antarctic seasons before a single catcher sailed. The fortunes of the whale fleet moved with the price of breakfast fats. Picture the anchor at its domestic end. A depression kitchen in Hamburg or Manchester, bread on the table, the scrape of the knife across something pale and modern from a printed wrapper. Nobody at that table had been told the word whale, and no label said it. 2 generations of Europeans ate the animal this way, daily, and never knew. The machine's last constraint fell in 1925. A stern slipway, patented 3 years earlier, was cut into a converted steamer called the Lancing, a ramp in the hull up which an entire blue whale could be winched from the sea onto a working deck. It sounds small. It changed everything because a factory that could swallow whales whole at sea no longer needed South Georgia or any shore or any government's lease. Beyond territorial waters, there was no law to need. Fleets followed, a mother factory wallowing at the ice edge, her catchers fanned out over the horizon, fuel and crews rotating like an army's. And note what fed the boilers and the catchers' engines: petroleum. The fuel that folklore credits with saving the whales is the fuel that carried the fleets to the last whales on Earth. While that machine assembled itself, The oldest kind of partnership in the trade was quietly dying on the far side of the world. At Twofold Bay in New South Wales, the Davidson family had rowed after whales for some 70 years in open boats, with help. A pod of killer whales worked the bay alongside them, harrying passing baleen whales inshore, thrashing the water off the whalers' station, the old newspapers describe it, until the men turned out, and taking as payment the one part of the kill they prized, the lips and the tongue, an arrangement the town called, with perfect seriousness, the law of the tongue. Photographs survive of the boats and their black-finned partners. So do embellishments, because a story that good never stays its own size. The most famous of the pod, Old Tom, wore deep grooves in his teeth that the town attributed to gripping tow lines. He was found floating in the bay in September 1930, and Eden built a museum around his skeleton the following year. When his genome was finally read, nearly a century on, the 90-year-old patriarch of legend turned out to have been an animal in his 30s. Even the whales get mythologized given time. He died, as it happened, in the last season the old arrangement existed anywhere. Because that same Austral summer, the new arrangement showed its full face. In the season of 1930 to 31, 41 factory expeditions with more than 200 catchers went south and killed over 40,000 whales, more than 29,000 of them blue whales, the largest animals that have ever lived, taken in a single summer. More blues died in that one season than exist today in all the waters around Antarctica, several times over. The catch came to some 3.5 million barrels of oil, and the market's verdict on this achievement was instant. The price fell from around £25 a tonne toward 12, and most of the fleet spent the following season laid up at anchor. They had killed so many whales that whales were briefly worthless. The pause was the market's, not conscience's, and it lasted one season. The paper that followed has a bitter shine to it now. A Geneva Convention in 1931 protecting the right whales, a species the trade had already emptied, a lock turned on a vacant room, and a 1937 agreement on minimum lengths and seasons, signed while the catch curves bent ever upward. The truest document of the age was drafted by the industry itself in 1932. The Blue Whale Unit, the accounting device by which one blue equaled 110 barrels, equaled 2 fin whales, equaled 2.5 humpbacks, equaled 6C. A whale was now formally a quantity of oil wearing a body, and in all the surviving files of those years, tonnage returns, price contracts, spring specifications for accumulators, there is one thing a searcher never finds: a page of doubt. If anyone aboard or ashore asked aloud how long 10,000 whales a season could keep coming, the question was never thought worth the ink. At evening in Cumberland Bay, between the anchored catchers with their banked fires, a blue whale sometimes rose in that era, the blow standing tall in the cold, the long back going by like a reef given motion, close enough to wet the mooring lines. Alongside her lay the machines, riveted this decade, leased for 20 years, depreciating on a schedule in a Buenos Aires ledger. Alongside them lay her, the Ice Age's patient masterwork, 4.5 million years in the assembling, on loan to the bay for an evening. She filled her lungs twice and went down the way her kind had gone down, since before there was anyone to count in units of anything, and the water closed, and on the flensing plain, the night shift lit its lamps. In the returns that the Soviet Union filed, season after season, with the International Whaling Registry in Norway, the number of humpback whales its fleets had taken in the Southern Hemisphere came across all the years combined to 2,710. The figure sat in the printed tables beside everyone else's figures in the same typeface, part of the official record of a regulated industry. The registry printed what it was sent. It had no way of doing anything else. The world that number belonged to was built in a single hungry year. The war had put the Antarctic hunt on pause and sunk much of its tonnage. Peace restarted it as an instrument of food policy. In August 1946, the American occupation authorities in Tokyo, over formal protests from Australia, Britain, New Zealand, and Norway, authorized Japan to convert 2 ships and send them south because Japan was starving and whale was calories. 4 months later, in Washington, 15 nations signed the convention that created the International Whaling Commission, whose purpose, in its own preamble, was to make possible the orderly development of the whaling industry. That is not a phrase anyone had to dig for. It is the Charter's plain text, and for its first 15 years, the Commission lived down to it, a club of whalers setting the rules of whaling. The Antarctic quota it adopted, 16,000 blue whale units, was carried over from a wartime protocol. No one had ever counted the stocks it was drawn against. And because the quota was global, first come, first served, each season became a race the whalers themselves called the Whaling Olympics. Every fleet killing as fast as possible before the total was reached, an arrangement that rewarded speed, punished restraint, and audited nobody, since no international observer would set foot on anyone's factory deck for another 26 years. That same December, a factory ship handed to Moscow as German war reparations steamed south under a new name, Slava, Glory, and the Soviet Union entered the trade. What the catch meant ashore depended on where ashore was. In the Japan of 1947, close to half of all the meat eaten in the country that year was whale. Through the 50s, after the school lunch law, it became the taste of childhood itself, a slab of dark meat battered, fried, and glazed sweet with soy, eaten off aluminum trays in 100,000 classrooms by a generation that would remember it the way other nations remember wartime bread. At the peak, in 1962, Japan ate some 233,000 tons of whale in a single year. Into the early 60s, it was the country's largest single source of meat, ahead of beef, pork, and chicken. Britain tried the same trick and failed at it. Whale steak went on sale off-ration from 1947, along with a cornered version marketed under the invented name Wacon, and the public delivered its verdict at the counter. Gerald Elliott, of the Scottish whaling firm Salveson, put the British problem in a single line. The difficulty was that no one would eat it. By the mid-50s, with rationing gone, so was the experiment. The fleets of one nation feeding a people who needed them, the fleets of another feeding a market that politely declined. The club's rules bound its members loosely. A freelancer they did not bind at all. From 1950, the shipowner Aristotle Onassis ran a factory fleet under Panama's flag, and its practice was documented afterward in sworn statements from its own German crewmen, undersized whales, protected species, seasons ignored, logbooks composed like fiction. In November 1954, Peru lost patience, and its Navy and Air Force seized the fleet at sea and marched it into port. The affair cost $3 million in fines paid promptly. Then, Lloyd's of London reimbursed the fines under Onassis's policies, added roughly $1 million more for time lost, and in 1956 he sold the entire fleet to Japan at a handsome profit. The one whaling pirate the whole world caught red-handed came out of the story richer than he went in, a detail worth holding on to whenever this era's incentives are being weighed. But the largest deception was institutional, and it wore a flag. Through the late 50s, the Soviet fleet grew. The largest factory ship afloat in 1959, another giant 2 years later, 2 more for the North Pacific after that, even as the British and Dutch were selling up, and it answered neither to the Commission nor, in any meaningful sense, to the market. It answered to the plan. The State Planning Agency handed each fleet an annual target in gross output, tonnage, not species, not legality, and the incentives were mechanical. Meet the plan, and the crews drew a 25% bonus, beat it by a fifth, and the bonus rose to 60, and next year's target rose to match, forever. Under that gearing, the fleets killed whatever surfaced, protected species, nursing mothers, undersized calves, right whales off limits since 1935. In the early years, when only the blubber counted toward oil tonnage, carcasses were sometimes stripped of their coats and let go. One of the fleet scientists, Alfred Berzin, would remember whole days when the sea around the ship ran red. And below decks, while the returns were being drafted, something stranger was happening. At a steel table under the flensing deck of the factory ship Sovetskaya Rossiya in the early 60s, a young fisheries biologist named Yuri Mikhaev would measure each whale as it came aboard and fill out a card the government itself required for internal science: true species, true length, sex, and again, the entry the radioed return would never carry: pregnant, with the unborn calf measured too. 2 documents left that deck for every whale. One went to Norway by radio and was false. One went into a drawer and was true. Security officers sailed with every fleet to keep the first kind consistent. The second kind, the scientists quietly kept. Set the 2 documents side by side, as it finally became possible to do, and the registry's figure detonates. Reported southern humpbacks, all seasons, 2,710. Actual, 48,702. In just 2 seasons at the turn of the 60s, Soviet fleets killed some 25,000 humpbacks in the waters south of Australia and New Zealand, and on those coasts, the whales simply stopped arriving. Australia's and New Zealand's shore stations went from plenty to nothing in 3 seasons and closed their doors, baffled, ruined by a cause that was steaming home under a red flag with its returns falsified. Across the whole enterprise, from 1946 into the 70s, the Soviet fleets killed about 534,000 whales and left nearly 179,000 of them out of the books entirely. The largest sustained falsification in the history of any wild harvest, conducted inside the world's system for preventing exactly that, against which the century's full account should be read out once, plainly. Industrial whaling from 1900 to 1999 killed 2,894,094 whales. In the words of the scientists who finally compiled it, perhaps the largest hunt in sheer mass in human history. By 1962, the century had already killed as many sperm whales as the entire age of sail had taken in 200 years. By 1972, it had done so twice. The fin whale bore the heaviest single share, nearly 900,000. The blue whale was passing out of reach of any recovery arithmetic at all, sliding toward the few hundred that would remain in Antarctic waters by the early 70s, far below the fleets, in the Sound Channel where a fin whale's deep pulse can cross an entire basin. The change had its own signature, though no instrument was yet listening. Run the population curves backward, and the conclusion is hard to dodge. Year over year through these seasons, calls that had always drawn answers were drawing fewer, and the ocean's oldest chorus was thinning towards solo voices. South Georgia, where the century of this began, did not live to see the end of it. The island stations processed, in their 61 years, 175,250 whales. By the 60s, the bay that Larsen had found crowded was yielding sei whales and undersized fins. The leavings of the feast and the last seasons ran under Japanese lease as a salvage operation. Grytviken went quiet after the season of 1964 to 65. Leith Harbour, the last of the seven, closed in December 1965. No law shut them, no campaign, no change of heart. Nobody stopped them, they ran out. The protections came along behind like obituaries. The humpback protected in 63, the blue in 66, each species locked away only after the fleets had emptied the room, and the fleets that remained simply went further afield. The following November, catchers from the great Soviet factory ship swept the Arabian Sea from the Gulf of Aden toward India and killed 238 humpbacks in 10 days out of the one population on Earth that never migrates at all. That small, resident nation of Wales was crippled in a week and a half, and it is listed as endangered to this day. The truth of all of it, the real species and lengths, the mothers, the measured unborn, existed through those decades in exactly one form. Dmitry Tormosov, one of the fleet biologists, held back more than 57,000 of the whale cards. Mikolev and a handful of colleagues did the same with theirs, at a risk it is difficult now to size from outside. None of them ever fully explained the keeping. Call it conscience or the scientist's stubborn reflex that a fact must exist on paper somewhere, even if nowhere safe. Berzin, who had watched the red water, would end his memoir with a whaler scientist's own verdict on his industry. Simply criminal. And so the era closes on its true archive, a drawer in a Black Sea flat, winter after winter, holding 57,000 small documents of the dead, filled out honestly on a deck built for lying, and waiting 30 years for the world to be allowed to read them. There was a second hidden archive of whales in those same years, and it lived in a drawer in Bermuda. Reels of quarter-inch tape, carefully labelled, accumulating for a decade and a half in the keeping of a Bermudian electronics engineer named Frank Watlington, who worked at a Columbia University listening station out on St. David's Island. A Cold War post whose hydrophones hung far down in the deep sound channel, paid for by a navy that wanted to hear Soviet submarines. What came up the wire every spring, filling the headphones of men listening for propellers, was something else entirely. Long, patterned, unearthly calling, arriving out of the sound channel from the humpbacks that pass Bermuda on migration. Watlington taped it year after year from the 50s onward and told almost no one, and his reason, as Katie Payne would later explain it, was precise. He was afraid the whalers would use the songs to find the whales. In the same decade, on opposite sides of the world, the whale had two secret archives, one hidden to protect a lie, and one hidden to protect the singers. It later turned out the vault ran deeper still. At Woods Hole, there survives a recording cut in 1949 on an office dictation disc, the oldest whale song we hold, made by men who never learned what they had. By 1967, the secrecy had begun to feel like a losing strategy because the counting had gone public. The year before, a researcher named Scott McVeigh had laid the collapse of the great whales out in the pages of Scientific American. And when a young scientist named Roger Payne arrived in Bermuda with his wife Katie, Watlington made his decision. Payne was an odd and perfect choice of heir. His career to that point had been the physics of small ears, how an owl fixes a mouse by its rustle, how certain moths hear a hunting bat and jam the attack. Katie Payne had trained in music. Watlington played them the tapes, and then he gave them away outright, with an instruction the Paynes repeated for the rest of their lives: listen and go save the whales. To understand what happened next, it helps to have been in the boat, and the Paynes' own accounts put us there. Off Bermuda in spring, engine off, the water is a lit blue column going down black, and somewhere below hangs the singer, a bull humpback, 40-odd tons, head down at a slant, long white fins loose at his sides, motionless but for the smallest corrections. What reaches the boat does not behave like ordinary sound. It comes up through the planking. The pains described lying against the hull and feeling the song in the sternum. The wood itself gone resonant like the body of a cello. Low groans that climb octave over octave into cries, ratcheting pulses, descending runs that end in something like a vast sigh, phrase after phrase for minutes on end. And then, at the end of the long form, the whole architecture starts again from the beginning. The patterned calling that entered this history 50 million years back, the habit no one was in a position to overhear, was finally being overheard. Katie Payne's ear and the spectrograph's patient pictures turned the experience into anatomy. The sounds resolved into units, units built phrases, phrases repeated into themes, themes assembled in fixed order into a song lasting anywhere from 7 to 30 minutes, and the song repeated, sometimes for hours. The report Roger Payne and Scott McVeigh published in Science on the 13th of August 1971 made the cover of the journal, and its opening line has the calm of a scientist writing down something enormous as flatly as possible. Humpback whales, it begins, produce a series of beautiful and varied sounds, and then repeat the series with considerable precision. Every male in an ocean, it developed, sings the current song, the same one, and the deeper marvel surfaced when the Paynes ran the archive backward through Watlington's oldest reels. The song changes. Continuously, cumulatively, in one direction, with every singer in the population adopting each revision and no old song ever performed again. It was composition, ocean-wide, in slow motion, and decades on, researchers would watch entire basins take up a neighboring ocean's song the way a fashion sweeps a continent. The chain of luck behind our knowing any of this deserves its own sentence. It took a Cold War, a freak channel in the sea that carries voices 1,000 miles, and one engineer who loved the thing he was paid to listen past. What Payne did with the discovery was, for a scientist of his generation, close to heretical. He made a record album. Songs of the Humpback Whale appeared in 1970 on the small label of a psychology magazine, price $9.95. No narration to speak of, just the animal. Picture its first performance in an ordinary carpeted living room, the needle down, a hiss, and then that low rising moan filling the space between the sofa and the lamp, the listener picking up the sleeve to check again that this was real. It sold past 100,000 copies and kept going, eventually certified the best-selling nature recording in history. And for 8 surreal weeks, it sat on the Billboard 200, number 176, an animal on the pop chart, shelved between rock bands. That same autumn, Judy Collins folded the whales into Farewell to Tarwathie, an old whaling ballad of all things, sung tenderly over the hunted themselves on an album that went gold. And in June, the New York Philharmonic premiered a concert work for orchestra and taped whale song. 12 months, draw to concert hall. Against the century's total, 2,894,000, the counterweight, when it finally arrived, was a $10 record. The politics moved faster than politics moves. In 1970, the United States put all 8 great whales on its endangered list. In December 1971, the last American whaling station, a small outfit on San Francisco Bay, went dark. Around the same time, the last sperm oil drained out of American industry. The gearboxes of Chapter 1's ordinary cars finally weaned, their eventual substitute pressed from a desert shrub called jojoba. In October 1972 came the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and that June in Stockholm, the first Great United Nations Conference on the Environment, an inflatable whale bobbing over the demonstrations outside, adopted a call for a 10-year worldwide moratorium on commercial whaling without a single vote against. Japan abstained, and Norway, of all flags, voted yes. Weeks later, the Whaling Commission took up the same proposal and killed it, 4 votes to 6. It did so again the following year. The world had changed its mind about the whale. The club that managed the whale had not, and the gap between those two facts now had an audience. Into that gap, on the 27th of June, 1975, sailed an old halibut boat called the Phyllis Cormac, chartered by a young Vancouver outfit called Greenpeace, which found what it was looking for 50 miles off the California coast, the Soviet factory fleet Dalny Vostok, one of the fleets whose paperwork the world now knows was invented, working sperm whales on the Mendocino grounds. The plan was an idea of Bob Hunter's, a former newspaperman aboard, who preached what he called the mind bomb. Not force, but an image that would detonate in living rooms. He got his image at the price of nearly being under it. Hunter and a crewmate named George Karotva put their inflatable boat between a catcher's bow and the fleeing whales, and the gunner fired anyway, the harpoon passing over their heads, close enough to flinch at, the line hissing down into the water beside them. The New York Times reported that the grenade head drove through 20 inches of blubber and burst. A whale died within yards of the camera, and Fred Easton's film of all of it reached the American networks within days, Walter Cronkite's Evening News by the crew's own telling, while a still photograph of the dying animal ran in papers around the world. The change it made was simple and irreversible. For a century, the whale had died over the horizon. The film moved the death to dinner time into the same rooms where the record had been playing for 5 years, and the two arrivals, first the voice, then the harpoon, completed each other in the public mind in a way no pamphlet ever managed. Off Bermuda, meanwhile, in the blue light below the listening station's old water, the spring singers went on exactly as before, because none of it, the chart position, the votes, the film, existed where they were. Head down, fins loose, one bull holds his station and works through the long form. The climbing cries, the ratchets, the great sighing descents, every phrase in its place, on past the end and straight into the beginning again. The same song the whole ocean is singing that year and will have revised by the next. On the deck above, on an April evening in that era, a reel of 1/4-inch tape turns patiently beside the hydrophone cable until it runs out against its leader and flaps. The song does not run out. It keeps unspooling into the dark water below the boat, structured and enormous and unowed to anyone, going on long after the tape has nothing left to hold it. The hall was in Brighton, on the English seafront, a carpeted conference room in the last week of July 1982, with nameplates and water jugs and simultaneous translation, the kind of room in which nothing in particular has ever happened. 37 national delegations had credentials on the tables. Somewhere in the paperwork lay a draft amendment whose operative words ran, "Catch limits for the killing for commercial purposes of whales from all stocks shall be 0. It had taken 7 years to fill that room, or 900, depending on where the counting starts. The filling had been done from below and by mail. In the years after the Mendocino film, the whale had become the first truly global wildlife cause. The boycott lists, the school projects, the marches with papier-mâché flukes. And in January 1979, the campaign acquired its strangest weapon of scale. National Geographic bound a flexible plastic record of the humpback songs into an entire print run of its magazine, 10.5 million copies, the largest single pressing of any recording the world had yet made. The song that had lived on one engineer's reels a dozen years earlier now arrived unasked in mailboxes on 6 continents, and a subscriber in Ohio or Osaka could hold the January issue and play the animal itself. Governments can ignore almost anything, but they are bad at ignoring what their voters' living rooms sound like. Whaling nations began converting one at a time, and Australia's conversion had a black, clean irony to it. The country's last station, Cheney's Beach, near Albany in the west, announced its closure on the very day its government's formal inquiry into whaling opened its public hearings. The last whale ever taken by the English-speaking world, a female sperm whale, was killed off Albany on the 20th of November 1978. Within a year, Australia had banned whaling outright and then re-enlisted on the opposite side of the argument entirely. A hunter for 150 years, an abolitionist inside 18 months, and loud about it ever after. The most instructive collision of those years, though, happened in the far north, and it cut across every easy version of the story. In 1977, the Commission's scientists, fearing the bowhead was nearly gone, the working estimate ran from 600 animals to perhaps 2,000, zeroed the ancient subsistence hunt of the whaling people of Arctic Alaska, the Inupiat and their neighbors, the living heirs of the skinboat crews from 9 centuries back. For them, this was not policy, it was existence. Unlike the Finnmark fishermen of an earlier chapter, they burned nothing. They organized an Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, formed within months, won back a small quota that same winter, and then did the genuinely radical thing. They funded a census of their own, arguing that the government's counters had counted only the open water when any hunter knew bowheads travel under the ice. The ice-based count, backed with hydrophones, eventually proved them right in full. The stock was several times the official guess and growing at about 3% a year, straight through the managed hunt. And the arrangement that grew from that fight, hunters and biologists running the count together, would quietly become the best functioning piece of whale governance on Earth. The people who still killed whales had turned out to understand counting them better than the institution protecting them. That sentence deserved more attention than it got. Meanwhile, the club's own walls were moving. 14 members in 1972, 23 by 1979, 37 seated at Brighton, and most of the newcomers were small or distant states with no whaling fleet at all, recruited to the cause by the anti-whaling campaign, which had noticed that the convention was open to any nation willing to pay its dues. The pivot was the Seychelles, which joined in 1979 and promptly won the creation of an Indian Ocean sanctuary and a ban on factory ship whaling for everything but the minke. Fairness requires the note that the tactic belonged to no one. In later decades, Japan would assemble its own block of small member states by the same method, and both sides would deplore the practice in each other while working it themselves. So the room came to the 23rd of July 1982 with the Seychelles moving the amendment. What the cameras and the minutes record is almost disappointingly ordinary. Placards and raised hands around U-shaped tables, tellers conferring, a chairman reading a result into a microphone, 25 in favour, 7 against, 5 abstaining. The 3/4 threshold cleared with a vote to spare, and the tally went home to Washington in a diplomatic cable 3 days later, the changing of a 900-year-old human habit, preserved for history in the driest instrument bureaucracy owns. Commercial catch limits would fall to 0 with the seasons of 1985 and 86. The science would be reviewed by 1990. From the towers of Guitaria to a seafront hotel room, the going out had taken most of a millennium to build, and the stopping, in the end, took one show of hands. Then came the fine print, because the convention had been written by whalers in 1946 and its escape hatches still worked. Any government objecting within 90 days was simply not bound. Japan, Norway, Peru and the Soviet Union all filed, and though Peru thought better of it, the others held their cards. Japan traded its objection away under American pressure on its fishing rights, and then, the moment the withdrawal took effect, returned to the Antarctic under the convention's science clause, issuing itself research permits for hundreds of whales a season whose meat went to market exactly as before. Norway kept its objection in a drawer and reopened commercial minke whaling in 1993. Iceland ran research hunts, quit the commission altogether, and came back years later carrying a reservation of disputed legality. So the comfortable version, whaling ended in 1986, is not quite what the paper says. Tens of thousands of whales have been killed under those clauses since. What the vote actually did was narrower and still enormous. It ended the default. For the first time since a Basque town stamped a whale into wax, killing one was the thing that required the explanation. And the catch tables hold one more correction, which should be laid down plainly and left alone. 99.1% of the 20th century's whaling was already finished by the morning of the Brighton vote. Of the century's nearly 2,900,000 whales, all but 23,803 were dead before a single hand went up. The room in Brighton was voting on the remainder. Zero, from that day, was the law of the paper. What zero would look like in the water, whether emptied oceans refill, and how fast and whether all of them do, was a question no document could answer, and finding out would take the better part of 40 years. Far to the north of that seafront hall, off Arctic Alaska, the spring lead had opened on time that year, and a bowhead came up along the seam of dark water to breathe. A heavy, unhurried animal, half a metre deep in blubber, quite plausibly alive since before Sven Foyn patented his cannon. The entire industrial age of whaling, the grenades, the factories, the plans, the vote, had happened inside the span of that one animal's lifetime. She blew and filled the long lungs and slid back under the white roof of her country, carrying no news of Brighton, on her way to outlive that too. On a headland north of Sydney at first light, any winter morning now, the answer to Brighton's question arrives on the wind before it arrives in the eye. A soft concussion of breath, then another, then three together, out where the sea is still grey. And as the light comes up, the blows resolve into bodies, and the bodies keep coming hour after hour, a river of humpbacks running the coast the way they ran it before any of this. In the early 1960s, after the seasons in which the Soviet fleets worked the grounds south of here, the whales passing this headland numbered around 150. All of them, the entire breeding population of eastern Australia, could have fitted in one suburban car park. The most recent counts put the migration above 50,000, which is more humpbacks than the whalers themselves ever found here. The population grew at 10 and 11% a year, decade after decade, until it ran up against the oldest limit of all, the ocean's own capacity, and levelled off. 40-odd years after a room in Brighton voted a word onto paper, this is what zero looks like in water. Nor is that coastline the exception. In the western South Atlantic, the humpbacks of Brazil have climbed back to roughly 93% of their estimated original abundance, a wound closing within 4 human generations. The bowhead off Arctic Alaska stands at or near its pre-whaling strength, having recovered the entire way while still being hunted, under the count the hunters themselves helped build. The fin whale, the century's heaviest casualty, has been lifted off the top tier of the endangered lists, its worldwide numbers back around 100,000. And in February 2020, a survey ship working the bays of South Georgia, where 2 decades of dedicated searching had produced exactly 1 blue whale, logged 58 of them in a few weeks, blues feeding again under the mountains that processed their ancestors, singing in water that had gone silent for 50 years. Around Antarctica as a whole, the blues have crept back to perhaps 3,500, increasing steadily. Even the hard cases complicate hope rather than cancel it. The grey whale, fully recovered by the 1990s, was then knocked from 27,000 down toward 13,000 by a die-off tied to its rearranging Arctic feeding grounds, and may now be climbing again. Recovery, it turns out, is not a straight line and is not owed. And recovered is itself a word worth holding at arm's length, because it depends on which century is allowed to be the baseline. The logbook reconstructions describe one original ocean. Genetic methods have argued for one twice or 3 times as full. 20 years of argument have narrowed that gap without closing it. The honest sentence is this: tonight's sea is fuller than our grandparents and emptier than their grandparents, and nobody alive has seen the original. The clearest unhealed wound swims off the east coast of North America, and it is the oldest character in this whole history, the North Atlantic right whale, the Sarda, the Towers whale, the one the Basques rode out for 9 centuries ago. The most recent count is about 384, of which perhaps 70 are breeding females. More than 8 in 10 carry the scars of fishing rope. The leading causes of death are entanglement and ship strikes, which is to say that nobody kills them on purpose anymore and they die anyway as a side effect of ordinary commerce moving at ordinary speed. Last season brought 23 calves, the most in 17 years and about half of what recovery requires. A proposal to widen the speed limits protecting them was withdrawn in early 2025. Its Pacific cousin is rarer still, some 30 individuals, the scarcest great whale on Earth. The harpoon, whatever else is true of it, had a harbour and a name. The rope and the hull have neither. The hunt itself survives, in remnants that would fit inside a single chapter of the old ledgers. Norway kills a few hundred minke whales a year under its standing objection, against quotas it never fills, for a market that keeps shrinking. Iceland suspended its own fin whale hunt in 2023, after its state veterinarians filmed and timed the killing and reported that 4 whales in 10 died slowly. 1 was chased for 5 hours, the first time in this entire history that a whaling nation stopped itself on grounds of mercy. 2 empty seasons followed, then a 5-year license issued by a caretaker government. Then, in June 2026, a resumption. 2 fin whales landed as this account was being finished, even as the new government drafts a bill to ban the trade outright. Permission without a market, and a market without appetite. Japan left the commission in 2019 and whales its own waters openly now. It added fin whales to its quota in 2024 and launched a brand new, nearly $50 million factory ship for a nation whose whale meat consumption has fallen from the 233,000 tons of 1962 to 1 or 2,000, less than a mouthful per citizen per year, with thousands of tons sitting frozen and vending machines deployed to move it. And in the far north, the oldest hunt of all continues exactly as it has for 900 years. 67 bowhead strikes a year, co-managed, sustainable, the skin boat still launching from the ice, while the Makah people of Washington State, holders of the only treaty in American history that explicitly guarantees a whaling right, won their federal waiver in 2024 and, as of this telling, are still waiting for the paperwork that lets them use it. Meanwhile, the living whale has quietly become worth more than the dead one ever was. At the last full global census, 13 million people a year were paying to go and look at whales. a business worth over $2 billion annually then and larger now. Iceland alone hosts several 100,000 whale watchers a year, against a whaling industry employing perhaps 100. And the science of these decades has revealed what the subtraction actually cost in a currency nobody suspected. Tagging studies published in 2021 showed that baleen whales eat about 3 times what anyone had estimated. Before whaling, the Southern Ocean's whales consumed on the order of 430 million tons of krill a year, roughly double the entire krill stock that exists there today. And when the whales were removed, the krill did not bloom in their absence. It declined. The whales had been farming their own ocean, cycling iron through it, fertilizing the very swarms they ate. And the fishermen of Finnmark, who tore down a whaling station insisting that everything in a sea is connected, turn out to have been asking precisely the right question a century early. Even in death the animal builds. A single sunken carcass feeds a deep-sea community for decades, 400 species and more, including worms that exist nowhere on Earth except in whalebone. Economists have lately priced all these services, $2 million a whale by one much-quoted estimate. And the sober assessment is that the carbon numbers are real but modest. Whales help. They will not offset anyone's emissions. They were never obliged to be useful, and the interior of the animal keeps opening. The sperm whales of the Pacific, we now know, live in clans thousands strong that mark themselves with distinct dialects of clicks, identity badges in sound. In 2024, researchers mapping thousands of recorded exchanges reported a combinatorial structure underneath, a kind of phonetic alphabet, though what any of it means remains entirely unshown, and some colleagues consider the alphabet framing overdrawn. The Humpback Song is still, after 55 years of study, a masterpiece without a translation. Roger Payne died in June 2023 at 88, still publicly asking what it was he had spent his life listening to. Even the era's loneliest legend has softened under scrutiny. The famous whale that calls at 52 Hz, the wrong frequency for anybody, tracked for years through the Navy's old arrays. Other whales can almost certainly hear it perfectly well. Later recordings suggest there may be more than one, and the loneliness, it appears, was always ours, projected onto a voice that was merely unusual. And in 2007, hunters off Alaska landed a bowhead carrying deep in its blubber a fragment of brass harpoon lance of a pattern patented in 1879 and manufactured in New Bedford, an animal that had been swimming away from the Yankee fleet, with the Victorian age lodged in its body for 125 years. The endings belong beside their beginnings now. Laid together, they weigh one another without any help. In the winter of 1993, at a scientific meeting in Galveston, Texas, an elderly Russian biologist named Alexei Yablokov, by then an advisor to his country's president, stood up before the world's marine mammal scientists and told them the truth this account has already told. The returns were false. Then the old men opened the drawers. Mikhailev's cards, Tormosov's 57,000 passports, decades of honest ink kept at private risk, handed over, published, and turned into the corrected history of the 20th century ocean. The lie had lasted 30 years. The men who kept the truth outlasted the state that made them hide it. Beside that, a season and a census. More than 29,000 blue whales killed in one Antarctic summer of 1930, and about 3,500 alive in those waters now. And the recollection that of the century's near 3 million, all but the last 23,000 were dead before the world's hand went up. Beside that, a photograph from the 1st of March 2024. A survey plane south of Nantucket, of all waters, catching a grey whale alive in the Atlantic, The species whose bones made Ice Age spear points on the Bay of Biscay, extinct in that entire ocean for 3 centuries, arrived home through a northwest passage the warming sea had opened. The same heat that starves them in the Pacific unlocked the old door. Both things are true, and nobody gets to choose just one. Beside that, a skeleton in London. The blue whale that stranded at Wexford in 1891 and was finished by a lifeboat pilot with an improvised lance, sold for £250, stored for 42 years because no hall could hold her, and hung, in 2017, diving through the air of the museum's Great Central Hall in place of a dinosaur, under a new name the museum gave her, Hope. And beside all of it, the oldest layers still alive. A declaration signed at Rarotonga in 2024 by the Maori King and Pacific chiefs, recognizing whales as legal persons with inherent rights, law still catching up to it. The temple register in a whaling town on Japan's western coast, where 242 whales carry posthumous Buddhist names and the unborn were buried with rites. An old mirror of those Soviet cards, each in its way refusing to let the dead go uncounted. The fishermen of Vietnam who still bury a beached whale as chief mourners, grieving it like a parent. The blanket toss going up over the June ice in Arctic Alaska. The meanings turned out to be older than the industry and tougher. One more ledger entry, and it is the strangest in 13 centuries of them. In 1977, when the United States launched the 2 Voyager probes toward the outer planets and the stars beyond, the team around Carl Sagan fastened to each a gold-plated record, a message meant to outlast every library on Earth, and into it they mixed the Humpback song, Payne's recording, from Watlington's own Bermuda Water. They wove it underneath the 55 human greetings so that, as one of the record's makers later explained, the whales would speak for Earth alongside us. Any listener who ever decodes it will hear the 2 voices together, unlabeled, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. The record is engineered to remain playable for 1 billion years. Voyager 1 crossed into interstellar space in 2012. Its instruments are being switched off one by one as the power fades. This November, it will be a full light day from home, a day for a signal out, a day for the answer back, and after the transmitters die, it will simply go on, meeting nothing for 40,000 years. The whole span can be held once, gently, and then let go. 40 casks of whale oil creaking toward a Norman abbey in the year 670. 6 candles to the pound, and a parliament writing light itself in wax, the lamps, the ledgers, the plans, the vote. 13 centuries of turning this animal into light, and at the end of them offered one chance to choose a single voice to carry alongside our own into the permanent dark. We chose the animal we had been burning. The creature that lit the world became the word we sent into it. The rest belongs to the water. Off 100 coasts tonight, the boats go out with no irons in them, and somewhere one of them is drifting now with its engine cut, rocking, quiet. A humpback rises alongside. She is 40 tons and makes no sound but breath. She rolls slowly, and the eye comes up along the waterline. A dark, unhurried eye the size of an orange, and it moves along the rail, across the cameras, across you. It holds a moment longer than anyone expects. 900 years stand between her kind and the people at the rail, and for the length of that look, both parties simply float in it. Then the eye slips under, the long back follows, the flukes lift, stream, and go down without a sound, and the surface closes, seamless as ever. The sea holds its colour, the boat rocks. Far off, a blow drifts on the wind, and somewhere below right now, the song is going on, begun before we needed lamps, revised this very season, older than every word for it. The ocean is still singing, good night.